Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're really grateful you're going to take the next hour or so to be with us to talk about the IRA. I wanted to start by just acknowledging the land that I am on and that many of you might find yourself on. It is oftentimes the case that we don't think about the fact that our higher ed institutions weren't the first occupants of that land. So my name is Tim Carter. I'm coming to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is the unceded and ancestral land of the Massachusetts people, as well as the Nipmuc and Wampanoag peoples. As you probably know, Cambridge is home to many of a few of the world's most prestigious universities, both of which, or many of which, have been actually benefiting from the extractive relationship we have with this land here, some of the most expensive real estate in the country. So we just want to acknowledge that history means that we have an obligation to take reparative steps to work with indigenous populations and native communities to support and recognize the incredible contribution they can make to this work together. So would love it if Mia, I don't know if you have a link in the chat, but if you have a second and are able, feel free to write down and think about where you're dialing in from and the relationship you have with your land there. With that, we're going to start. I'm going to give a few slides here about context, and the title of this webinar is "The IRA Passed. What does that mean for the higher education sector?" So this is done in collaboration with America's All In and RMI, as well as support from MIT. So we're really grateful for those partners. A few housekeeping notes. We are recording this program, as you probably saw when you joined. We're gonna record it and it'll be posted online at secondnature.org. Please ask questions. We want you to have time to ask questions and have time to answer questions. So our panelists will answer questions at the end. I'll moderate that session, and you can add them in the Q&A box in the chat, or in the Q&A box. And of course, there's the chat function that if you have ideas as people are speaking, feel free to use the chat. But we're going to really look at the Q&A box for the places where the questions will take place. And no one's going to be able to talk because we don't want it to be chaos. So everyone's always going to be in mute mode the whole time. With that, I'm really grateful to have just a great lineup of speakers today. What we're going to do is dig into the IRA, but not going to be so detailed that we'll probably answer all the specific questions you have for your location. But we're going to get a little bit more granular than just what is in the IRA. But we also need to understand that context. So we're going to first have Tansy Massey Green, who's an associate at RMI, give the broader context of the IRA. And then Ippoliti Delatolas is a PhD candidate at MIT who's working with the Office of Sustainability there, and will give us some more explicit connection between the IRA and higher education. And then lastly, we wanted to actually have someone who can give a leadership perspective. And so we're really grateful for Steve Knapp, who's the president and CEO of the Carnegie Museums of Pittsburgh, and formerly was the president of George Washington University, as many of you might know, and had affiliation at Johns Hopkins. So he has experience with how leadership thinks about things like federal legislation or federal action. So he's going to close us off with that perspective. So that's the architecture of today, and we'll have about 15 minutes at the end to do questions and answers. So with that, Tansy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm going to pull my screen up here. All right. So hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Tim, for that introduction. I'm Tansy Massey Green. I work at RMI, and I work on the America's All In Coalition. That Second Nature is one of our core partners for. And I'm going to give you a broad overview of what's in IRA and all the different programs that we have. So to start things off, I just want to give you an overview of what this historic level of funding looks like. IRA alone is 4 times the amount of funding that we saw with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And now this year alone, we're seeing 3 times the amount of funding than we saw before this year with IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment in Jobs Act, with the CHIPS Act, which wasn't labeled as a climate act, but it has a lot of funding for research and development for clean energy. And of course, with the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's a really exciting time to invest in clean technology. It's a unprecedented amount of funding that we see. If we look at what IRA does for emissions reduction, the Repeat Project did a really nice graph of this. If we look at this bottom blue line, that is the path we need to be on to reach 50% emissions reductions by 2030, which is our national target. And then if you look at this purple line with IRA, that's where we're expected to be if all these incentives are taken up by consumers and businesses that are in IRA. And if you can see it, I mean, it gets us really close. It's expected to get us to 40% emissions reductions by 2030, IRA alone. So if all consumers take advantage of IRA and actually surpass what the expectation is, all these tax incentives are uncapped, so there's unlimited potential. We could get further, and of course, it's up to subnationals like universities and higher education institutions to fill that gap, that 10% gap, to get us to 50% by 2030. And if we look at the timeline of IRA, just to give you an overview of where we are, what we're expecting, IRA was passed on August 16th, and that's when electricity loan and grant programs went live automatically. The EV tax credit now has to meet these North America assembly requirements. And also the residential solar investment tax credits were bumped up to 30%. This is higher than they've ever been. At the beginning of the new year, this is when a bunch of tax credits that you see with all these new incentives, those incentives will go in place at the start of the new year. There'll be a new manufacturing production tax credit that goes live. And the one that's up with all the buzz, the really exciting one, is the EV manufacturing cap is lifted. So right now there's a limit to how many cars a manufacturer could sell that qualify for the electric vehicle tax credit. And that cap will be lifted at the start of the new year. So folks can get their tax credit with Teslas and Chevys again. And so that's going to be a game changer for electric vehicles. 180 days after the bill was signed into law is when the greenhouse gas reduction funds have to be distributed. And that is a pretty tight timeline to get. The greenhouse gas reduction funds is $27 billion out the door. So that's a quick timeline to get those set up. And then there'll be some hydrogen production tax credit guidance that comes out a year later. And 2 years later is when these rebate programs for electrifying homes, that's when the deadline goes in place. And we'll talk more about that later. But this is just the beginning of the guidance we have. There's so much that still has to be worked out. And we will update our partners to get the word out to all of you when we have that new guidance. I think the biggest thing that IRA shows is that the strategy for the transition has completely changed. If you ran numbers before IRA passed for investing in clean energy, and you thought maybe the fossil fuel counterpart made financial sense, those numbers have changed, and it now makes more sense, or the clean energy counterpart to fossil fuel is in line financially, and it now might make even more sense to invest in the clean technology. So I encourage you to run your numbers again. So now let's let's get into what IRA, what's in the bill itself, in the package itself, I should say. So the legislation is filled with incentives. There are all these carrots and no sticks, if you will. That means it's up to consumers and companies and nonprofits to take advantage, to do the work to get the money. This looks like tax credits, where the amount that you would pay towards the government in taxes is decreased. And so this is really great for the consumer, the business that pays taxes. But something new that's never been done before is this direct pay, which is a game changer for nonprofits, states, and cities, where tax exempt entities can get a check right from the government to do the same actions that a consumer would get and get a tax credit for. So game changer for the transition. Let's go into the sectors specifically now. So starting with the building sector, where we have improvements to existing tax credits. To start things off, there's the new energy efficiency home tax credit, where builders can receive up to $5,000 a unit. This is for new buildings and for major retrofits. For the individual homeowner or consumer, there's the residential energy efficiency tax credit, which it actually provides up to $3,200 in tax credits, where $2,000 of that is going to come from heat pumps, and the other $1,200 can come from other efficiency upgrades. So this is game changer for the average consumer. And then for commercial buildings, there's a deduction of up to $5 per square foot. And this is a deduction, not a tax credit. And for nonprofit or tax exempt entities, they can transfer this deduction to the builder and the benefit will come back. There's a way for the benefit to come back to the property owner. There are these new state-run grant programs, the High Energy Electric Home Rebate Program, which provides $4,000 for heat pumps for non-low and middle income households, and $8,000 for heat pumps for low and middle income households. So this is almost a free heat pump for these low income communities. And then there's the home energy performance-based whole home rebates, which provides a ton of money again for LMI households, $4,000 per unit or up to $8,000. And then there's a lot of other funding with buildings. There's money to implement building codes at for state and local governments. There's contractor training, which it's not a ton of money, 200 million, but it is one of the most impactful programs, because without the contractor training, of course, you can't do these other programs. And then there's these low embodied carbon labeling, which provides labeling for buildings that are not carbon intensive in their materials. Now let's look at the transportation sector. I'm going to pull out a few key programs in the next several sectors. And so for the transportation sector, obviously the hot one is the $7,500 EV credit that's already reinstated. And the big new one is that there's this $4,000 tax credit for used electric vehicles. And this one gives a little nod to equitable policies, where a family that couldn't afford a new EV, they now can get something by getting that used EV. The other really exciting part about the EV tax credit is starting in 2024, consumers will be able to transfer that tax credit back to the dealer, so that they really just get $7,500 off their new vehicle. The other exciting program here that I think could be relevant for all of you is the new $7,500 commercial clean vehicle credit for light duty vehicles, and the $40,000 for medium and heavy duty vehicles. And these tax credits do qualify for direct pay. So tax exempt entities can still qualify for these programs. Let's move on to the electricity sector. The big thing here is that the investment tax credit for putting in clean energy has been re-upped to provide 30% in their tax credits for consumers and businesses and nonprofits and other tax exempt entities. The ITC has been now qualifies for solar, geothermal, microgrid controllers, wind, and the new one is storage. So that means you'll get the credit for installing a battery, which is a really big deal. There's also the option between the investment tax credit and the production tax credit. The production tax credit is for entities looking to do large scale solar and geothermal. So likely utilities, but there's also power purchasing agreements that one could enter where the developer would get the tax credit, but the entity going in could still benefit. And so groups can choose between ITC or PTC. ITC is better for the smaller scale development that likely most of you would choose the ITC. The other really cool thing about ITC is that projects can actually qualify for up to 70% of a tax credit if the project is in a low income community. There's a bunch of different requirements to get these tax credits, like in a brownfield area and domestic content going towards production. But the extra kicker to go from 50 to 70% is if these projects are in low income communities. So big deal there. The big thing from the electricity sector is that we're seeing that the price for electricity is going to go down by 5 to 7% over the next decade with all of these programs. And this is, after all, called the Inflation Reduction Act. One of the biggest areas where inflation was occurring was in electricity. So this is one of those areas where costs will go down. And now just a quick summary of the industry sector. There's this new big tax credit for hydrogen production, which is exciting as an alternative fuel. And then there's the methane fee, which I said the whole package was filled with carrots and not sticks. I think this is the one stick that we see where methane emitters are going to be feed, or they're going to have a fee for their production, which will hopefully reduce the methane emissions, which is a really big deal as the larger, as a really potent greenhouse gas pollutant compared to carbon dioxide. And then the green bank would fall, the greenhouse gas reduction fund, aka green banks, falls into the industry summary, but I'm going to talk about in the next slide where to talk a little bit about environment and climate justice. And just as a broad statement, this is one of the first legislative packages that we see that starts to address equity in the US. It's just a little bit of a nod to equity, but it's a good start in the right direction. With the environment and climate justice block grants, it's projects for any community development. It's a really broad, so there'll be a ton of there's a ton of funding for community level projects. And then we get to the greenhouse gas reduction fund, which is just money to use towards projects to reduce greenhouse gases. And 15 billion out of the 27 billion that's set aside for the greenhouse gas reduction fund has to be for climate justice and equity projects. So this is a really big investment in this community development. And there's a ton of other programs that I would encourage you all to check out once you get access to these slides and can start looking some of these programs up. I'm going to wrap things up with this broad overview and pass it off to Ippoliti now for an overview of what universities specifically can do to take advantage of IRA.
Thanks a lot, Tansy. I'm also going to share my screen, hoping that this works fine. So hi everyone, I'm really happy to be here. I am going to dive a little bit deeper into the provisions of the IRA that are specifically relevant for institutions of higher education. Before I do that, just a little bit about myself. So I'm a PhD student in mechanical engineering at MIT. And in parallel to my PhD, I've been working as a graduate student researcher with the MIT Office of Sustainability to understand how federal and state legislation can help MIT advance its decarbonization goals and its energy transition commitment. So just a little bit of background. MIT recently released its Fast Forward Climate Action Plan, which sets its decarbonization goals. There's a long-term overarching goal of zero direct emissions by 2050 and a short-term goal of net zero emissions by 2026. So this short-term net zero goal can be achieved through offsite power purchase agreements and offsets as well. So recently I've been looking into how the IRA provision specifically can accelerate our commitment in the energy transition. And what I'll be presenting today is not like the final results of this study. This is still a work in progress, but it's more about our methodology and key takeaways for institutions of higher education in general. And this is because MIT is committed to decarbonize in a way that is scalable and in a way that takes into account policies at different scales. So the goal isn't to implement a one-of-a-kind solution that would be specific to MIT situation, but rather to stay connected with what's happening at the scale of city, the state, and the electric grid as well. So that's also where the knowledge and the understanding of the legislation plays a super important role. So specifically in the IRA, there are provisions that relate to universities' decarbonization goals. So this is everything that concerns campus building, infrastructure, and everything that consumes energy on campus. So there are provisions related to energy generation, energy efficiency, electrification of buildings, electrification of transport and electric vehicles, but also offsite PPAs, power purchase agreements for short-term decarbonization goals. Then, of course, institutions of higher education have a mission to do research, innovation, education, and there's also provisions related to that. And finally, something that's really explicit in the IRA and that Tansy touched upon is that institutions of higher education are also members of a community, and they can really take advantage of opportunities in the IRA to partner with their communities to advance environmental and climate justice, but also to do technology deployment. So if through their innovation they develop a certain technology, they can possibly take advantage of the IRA to help deploy that technology. So institutions of higher education are really in a unique position to contribute to accelerating the energy transition because they're at the intersection of these three buckets here. And the IRA has provisions relevant to all of these aspects that I'm going to dive a bit deeper into. Unfortunately, I can't go into too much detail, but we are working with Second Nature and the Aspen Institute to release a more comprehensive document on this topic, which we hope to get out before the COP. So stay tuned for that as well. So starting with provisions related to campus decarbonization goals. So there's, first of all, provisions related to clean energy. These are relevant both for on-campus electricity generation, but also for purchased electricity, either from the local grid or through offsite power purchase agreements. And the different tax credits and the way that they're going to influence cost and emissions of electricity throughout the country can also affect whether or not it makes more sense to do a certain power purchase agreement rather than another one, but also whether or not you should generate your own electricity on campus or purchase it from the grid, for example. So what are these tax credits? So there's the clean electricity production and investment credits that Tansy talked about. There's a first phase in which we just have a modification of current credits that goes until 2024. And then they switch to technology neutral emissions-based credits beyond 2025 and through 2032. These are both eligible for direct pay. There's the carbon oxide sequestration credit for carbon capture, also eligible for direct pay. Clean hydrogen production, eligible for direct pay as well. So there's also a zero emission nuclear credit and grants and incentive for transmission, which are less likely to apply directly to institution of higher education, but that could affect what happens on more generally in the grid. And as Sandy said a little bit, the tax credits depend on the requirements that are met. So they will be higher if prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements are met, if domestic content requirements are met, if they are located in an energy community. And there is also a specific credit for solar projects that are located in connection with low-income communities. So all of these factors there can affect, a university's decision when entering into a PPA or deciding where to buy their electricity. So continuing on campus decarbonization goals related to transportation, so electric vehicles, there's the qualified commercial clean vehicle tax credit, which is eligible for direct pay or can be transferred to the seller of a vehicle. And there's also the alternative fuel refueling property tax credit, which is just a long way to say a credit for putting up charging stations. This one is not eligible for direct pay, but it's also kind of constrained in the sense that it does not apply if you're located in an urban environment, and so you either have to be not in an urban environment or in a low-income community, but it could still apply to certain institutions of higher education. So on building energy efficiency, there's the commercial buildings energy efficiency tax deduction. So this is not a credit, it's a deduction. So it's not eligible for direct pay, but it can be transferred to the architect, designer, or planner of your building renovation. And there's a certain amount of money that's going to be allocated per square footage of building, as long as the renovation allows to reach a certain level of emissions reduction compared to previous values. And then it increases with the amount or the percentage of emissions that are reduced. There's also $1 billion in funding for states and local governments to implement latest and zero building codes. So these are codes for building emissions and building energy efficiency, which here are not going to be claimed directly by the university, but could affect what the university or institution of higher education has to do. So moving on to funding for research, there are certain opportunities to apply for funding for basic research. In particular, there's some money through 2026 that's given to NOAA to establish grants for research on coastal communities and climate resilience, as well as oceanic and atmospheric research and forecasting for weather and climate. And there is also funding for establishing a competitive grant program for the development of alternative fuels and low emission aviation technology. There's going to be a 75% cap on the federal cost share, but that's another opportunity that institutions of higher education can take advantage of. So moving on to the last part, which is institutions of higher education as community members, there are two grant programs that explicitly involve institution of higher education. The IRA explicitly says that they're eligible. The first one is these environmental and climate justice block grants. So there's $3 billion total funding through 2026 for this program. It's for grants that are up to 3 years. In order to be eligible, the institution of higher education has to partner with a community-based nonprofit because these grants should be given to community-led projects. So the projects must benefit disadvantaged communities, and different types of projects that are eligible include monitoring and reduction of air pollution, for example, through the deployment of low and zero emission technologies, but also workforce development. There's mitigation of climate and health risk is also eligible, climate resiliency and adaptation, projects that would reduce indoor toxics and air pollution, and finally, projects that facilitate the engagement of communities in state and federal advisory groups and in policy decisions in general. The second grant program is the Neighborhood Access and Equity Grant Program. So there's total $3 billion, about $3 billion funding through 2026 for this program, but 1.1 billion of that is not applicable to institutions of higher education. So there's a bit less than $2 billion for competitive grants that will be administered through the Federal Highway Administration. In order to be eligible, the institution of higher education has to partner with a state, local, or tribal government. And the project must be in a disadvantaged or underserved community. And the types of projects that are eligible for these grants are those that would improve walkability, safety, and affordable transportation access for communities, as well as mitigation and remediation of negative impacts from transportation infrastructure for communities. And the one where institutions of higher education are explicitly named as being eligible is planning and capacity building activities to assess the impact from transportation infrastructure, in particular highways and transportation facilities that are sources of air pollution, noise, stormwater, and other burdens. And this can also be achieved through public engagement. So these two programs I talked about are those where institutions of higher education are really referred to in the bill, but there are a lot of indirect opportunities for involvement of institution of higher education partnerships. So there's $5 million that will be given to the EPA for grants to establish programs for monitoring and reduction of air pollution in general, where institutions of higher education could be eligible. There's $27 billion for the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, $7 billion of which will go to deploying low and zero emissions technologies. And then a large chunk will also go to developing the smaller green banks, and institutions of higher education can also be involved in that. There is a lot of funding through either grants or tax credits for manufacturing and advanced technologies. So there, it will probably be a situation where the university develops a technology and then partners with industry to deploy it and could take advantage of the bill to get some funding for that. There's also funding for climate mitigation, forest resilience, where universities could partner with landowners, or if they're located in a rural environment, could likely claim funding for that themselves. It's mainly for tree planting, sorry, and forest resilience. And finally, there's funding for workforce development and training, particularly training for the agricultural sector and jobs in energy efficiency and electrification. So what I want to end with is, like, as you saw in my previous slide, there are really many opportunities for institution of higher education to take advantage of the IRA. Some of them are really direct and concern their decarbonization goals on campus, and then you have to go into the specifics of your campus to know exactly what you can claim. Some of them are for research funding, and there it's probably going to go through professors at the university who are going to claim that that funding, and some of them are a bit more broad and are really related to partnerships within community. And the second aspect is that the Inflation Reduction Act will no doubt affect policies at the state and local level, and will also affect what the electric grid is likely to do and what broader communities are likely to do. And this will will also have an impact on institutions of higher education. So when looking at how you can take advantage of the bill, it's also interesting to look at what your state and local government is doing and how ambitious these policies are compared to the IRA. In cases where the state or local government doesn't have very ambitious targets, that's also an opportunity for institutions of higher education to really be drivers of change in the energy transition. So I think I'm going to stop here and pass it back to Tim.
Awesome. Thanks. Thanks, Ippoliti. Thanks so much. So lots of great questions. We'll get to those at the end. Some are being resolved in real time in that Q&A. So feel free to keep loading us up there. Obviously, the first two speakers are really focused on the guts of the IRA, like what are the big categories of the bill, and then how does it specifically affect higher education? We wanted to step back now, and Steve is going to talk about from a president's perspective, or even now as a cultural leader, he's leading this cultural institution. How do leaders respond to these sorts of things? Because we thought that people on the webinar might actually not be the senior leader, but you may want to engage with your senior leadership team on these things and just raise some awareness about it. And it would be helpful to know how senior leaders think about this. So Steve, I would love to hear a couple of your thoughts on this before we get to the question and answers.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tim. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks to Tansy and Ippoliti for that really great set of presentations on the content. I don't have any slides, by the way. I'll just tell you that in advance. For the content of the bill, which I think is we're just sort of starting to grasp it, and it is a very comprehensive and complex set of information for us to absorb. My immediate reaction as thinking back to the time, so I spent 10 years as a university president. Before that, 11 years as provost at Johns Hopkins University. And now I'm in my third year as president of a union of 4 museums, 2 science museums, 2 art museums, the Carnegie Museums of Pittsburgh, and where the issues are a little bit different. I might touch on those, but I think mainly I'll focus on the higher education opportunities. And what immediately occurs to me is, given the range of ways in which this bill potentially connects with colleges and universities, I think it's really important that to take a holistic approach in any university administration. Often, as we've all experienced, there's a bit of a separation between the folks who concentrate on operations, and often that's led by a sustainability office in the case of climate action. A bit of a disconnect between those staff members and the research administration side of the institution, the vice president for research, if there is one, or vice provost for research, however that's structured in any given institution. What I'd really hope is that I see a lot of opportunities for synergy between the two, and I would hope that the research administrators and the operations administrators would work together collaboratively in sort of scrubbing the bill for all the possible opportunities that it presents. One area that I think that I wasn't really as focused on when I was thinking about the bill, but that really was brought forward by Ippoliti's very comprehensive presentation, is the opportunity for community engagement support. That's something that a lot of institutions are really focused on. Our museums right now, we're making the center of our strategic planning for the next number of years. We're focusing on what we're calling turning museums inside out, and it's looking for ways that museums can be more responsively engaged with the communities that surround them, with a particular focus on lower income and BIPOC communities. That's become a really important focus for a lot of cultural institutions, and of course for a long time has been true with universities. When we were working in Washington, D.C. with local communities, but also with the city government, the District of Columbia government, which is also, of course, the state government, we had a lot of cooperative engagement with communities, but it was not supported by the kind of federal funding that may now be available. For example, we did a plan for stormwater management, which is a major issue in many cities with more than 100-year-old sewer and storm drain systems that often intersect during storms and cause that end up dumping a lot of pollution into the river systems. We also helped the District of Columbia write its strategic plan for sustainability. But again, that was work that we either did pro bono, and which makes it hard to free up time for faculty and graduate students to be engaged in that work, or we did it with some support from the city. But this federal opportunity, I think, is pretty exciting. And I would really urge university administrators to work with faculty and staff to find ways of taking advantage of those and seeing if it can connect with some of the community work that they're already engaged in. But what it really comes down to is really scrubbing the bill for all the opportunities that might be there. The second thing I want to say about this is I think it's really important for universities to be cheerleaders at this point. That is, really support the effort. I'm constantly reminded of a meeting I had in the White House just a few weeks before the 2015 Paris Accords, or the Paris conference that led to the signing of the Accords in 2015. And I went there in the company of some actually students, graduate and undergraduate students, and one undergraduate made a point to the White House staff that were thinking about how to prepare for this summit. And the point was that no matter how it came out, it was really important to present it as a victory. In other words, we really have to make sure that we are emphasizing the positive elements of this amount of progress, rather than looking for kind of skeptical ways of worrying about things that aren't covered, or maybe some of the things that were added to the bill which were not necessarily in accordance with the main focus of it, things like that. Because those who oppose climate action really thrive on ambiguity and uncertainty and skepticism about the whole enterprise, and that's something we have to help push through. And I do think we have to, in doing so, be very responsive to our students. I think it's often the case that many of us who grew up in earlier eras don't fully appreciate the kind of existential angst that is associated with climate in the minds of our students and young people. And I still see that in the museum setting, just as I did in universities. That is, that there is this tremendous anxiety, I think, and I think it's even having some psychological effects that are demonstrable on rising generations. And so we've got to be mindful of that. And I think the presidents of universities and the deans and the faculty themselves can play a role in focusing on the positive steps that we can take collectively to address climate in ways that give hope and purpose and direction to students who are concerned about this. And I think that presidents who ignore these issues or only pay sort of occasional lip service to them are really kind of missing out on an opportunity to connect with their students in areas that really matter to them in a very deep way. So I'd like to see that kind of response as well. And so those are the two things I really wanted to emphasize. Tim and I'll be happy to step aside now and respond to any questions. I do want to say that things like the NOAA opportunities, by the way, as well, I was kind of excited to see those, and I'm sure universities are going to be looking at those kinds of opportunities to advance this work. Maybe I'll say one last thing, and that has to do with this, the kind of educational role that universities can play around this transition. We have an NSF grant at our museums for the Museum of Natural History, Carnegie Museum of Natural History. It's called the Climate and Rural Systems Partnership. And this is where we're running a consortium of public and private institutions looking at education about climate in rural settings and connecting those with the concerns of rural communities. And I think that kind of outreach, the kind of the social and educational and communicative role of universities can be expanded alongside this transition in ways that will support its public acceptance. And that's another role that I think universities can play. And it's something in which students can be, I think, engaged in a way that they'll find exciting and fulfilling. Let me stop there, Tim.
Thanks, Steve. It's so great. I love that championing role that universities can play, not blindly, but clearly as a beneficiary of something that gets passed. Oftentimes we forget that that's a key part of generating additional momentum for what's next down the line, either legislatively or within regulations. So I love that idea. So I'd love to invite Ippoliti. We actually have a new guest with us, Beth Hartman, also from RMI, and Tansy. Yep, see you all back on. And so we've addressed a lot of about half the questions, I guess, and so we'll try to get to a bunch of them. But I was going to bucket one specific one around direct pay, because this seems to be one of the issues that's kind of like the big game changer for tax exempt institutions, of which most higher ed institutions are. So could one of you just like kind of lay out what we've said direct pay, but like what does that mean? Like, what's the difference between direct pay and tax credits that maybe an institution indirectly benefited from because they were going to a for-profit entity that took advantage of that tax credit? Tansy, do you want to take a stab?
Yeah, so I actually have a really good article that I'm going to put in the chat, and I put it in one of the questions as well, that gives a really good overview of how this is a game changer for nonprofits. But basically, before IRA, nonprofits had to go through another company that would then go to do the actual building or the clean energy installments, so that there would be like a step in between to see the return of investment back of what that tax credit would look like. the company would get the tax credit, and then they would reduce that from the total cost of the project. And now you'll get a direct check from the government when you do these projects. And the details for that, like how to actually apply for the direct pay, have not been released yet. The Department of Treasury still has to give guidance of what that looks like. But it basically means that now, like, indeed, all these nonprofits are in the same ballgame as the companies.
Anyone else want to round that out? Yeah.
And there was a bunch of questions about geothermal specifically. And I just want to say that falls into the clean energy investment tax credits, which is really exciting. I guess a lot of different universities are doing projects with geothermal. And so, yes, that would qualify for direct pay as well.
And then there was some kind of questions about, does this, PTC apply, or does the ITC, whatever acronym you might be, and there does seem to be different rules for different sections of the bill. Is that right? So like, it's not just like everybody gets direct pay for everything that used to be a tax credit.
Yeah, so PTC, the production tax credit, is only going to be used for those really large scale projects. And I have to check, and I will right now, on like if there's direct pay for that. But it's my understanding that generally the groups that are on this call right now probably wouldn't choose the PTC unless they're going into a power purchasing agreement, in which case it would go through the developer, and therefore you would have that two-step process like there was before. Ippoliti, if you have more to say, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that most of the tax credits that are related to clean energy are eligible for direct pay. But for example, the building energy efficiency one isn't. So it kind of does depend on it doesn't say like all tax credits are now eligible for direct pay, and it kind of depends on the specific one. And also some direct pay are tied to certain requirements as well, like what I was saying about domestic content. Sometimes
Right.
That's also necessary in order to be eligible for direct pay.
Got it. Let's move away for a second from, so I hopefully that gives the audience a perspective on direct pay. Big deal, still some things to be worked out, but in general, a great opportunity for higher ed institutions specifically. I was really interested in this community connection. Steve, you brought it up. Ippoliti, you brought it up. And there was a question about workforce. And we didn't talk much, if at all, about what workforce elements were in the bill. And I wasn't sure, Tansy or Beth or Ippoliti, if you knew what was in the bill. And then maybe Steve, I was hoping you had mentioned some of these maybe community connections that involve cities and universities. And just thinking about like the connection to workforce, could that be an area that higher ed could take an advantage of more because this bill exists? Or is it kind of like more of the same that maybe we just hadn't been paying attention to as a sector in the past as much? So two-stage there.
My understanding of workforce development is that it's only in that contractor training, which I don't really know if that would apply for higher ed. So there's that 200 million for training, and in IRA, but in IIJA, what was passed earlier, there is a ton of funding for workforce development.
That's the Infrastructure Act.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like there's a good number of programs that qualify for workforce development, but not in IRA.
Yeah, I kind of had the same impression, like the amount of programs specifically for workforce development is very low in the IRA. There are two that kind of touch on that. One is funding for USDA to give out training grants to train people to enter agriculture jobs. And the other one is for DOE for grants for training for energy efficiency and electrification jobs. There are two sections on that. And then the rest is really tied into these apprenticeship requirements that are that can, make your tax credit higher.
So Steve, I guess given the maybe limited funding, at least in the IRA, how would a president, or how would you think about future generation, or even, curricular approaches that would take advantage of this workforce opportunity? Obviously, we need a clean workforce, and someone's got to supply that, right? And it seems like higher ed's the best entity to do that. So
Well, I think the challenge is identifying the level at which a college or university would become involved in this, right? And one of the first things I would do is contact the surrounding community colleges. I mean, one of the things I did quite a bit of, actually continuing to do now in this museum setting, is working with local community colleges, because we provide a lot of informal education as a museum, obviously, but we've just created a new workforce development program for students who are not necessarily college bound, sort of ages 18 to 25, in fields like digital marketing. We're actually doing that out of the Andy Warhol Museum, because Andy Warhol was quite an entrepreneur when it came to, sort of technical skills and technical experimentation. And the question is, how would you apply that to climate related jobs? But I would start probably looking at community colleges and seeing what kind of programs they've got going, and whether we could, as colleges and universities, support that or extend it, and maybe develop, help them to reach out to communities in ways that are connected with wherever we're located, our neighborhoods, and so on.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot more of the work that can be done. When I was chair of the consortium of universities in Washington, D.C., and one of the things I did was persuade my fellow presidents to get the community colleges into that consortium. They'd always been excluded because they were thought of as having a different mission. But it seemed to us that really to serve the community, we had to have kind of a full, series of a full spectrum of workforce and educational opportunities that we were connected with. I think there's more that can be done, and I would start there with community colleges.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and also an underappreciated role that we treat higher ed like a single uniform sector, but there's actually all this diversity within the sector according to institution type. So Ippoliti, from MIT's perspective, of course, you'd think about research, but the community colleges here in the Boston area, there's tons of them, and they actually could be a great direct training partner for these programs, as well as maybe a partner on some of the research activity as well. So I really think those 2-year technical colleges and community colleges, it seems like a great opportunity for this bill to kind of elevate the role. I wanted to shift a little bit on how the green bank is going to work, because it does seem like that's this big pot that's just going to sit there, and we're not exactly sure what that's going to look like. How does it work, and then how might universities participate in the distribution of funds from the green bank?
I'll take a first stab at this. So another disappointing answer that it's not clear. There's still guidance.
Oh, come on.
I know. But if I may share my screen really quick, I have some slides that gets into what it looks like. And all right. So there's $27 billion going into greenhouse gas reduction fund that has to, like I said before, start getting deployed in 180 days. So in February, which is a ton of money to get out the door. There's going to be the $12 billion that's for the general fund. It's going to go through nonprofit entities to distribute. The 12 billion with the 8 billion for the environmental justice funds, those are going to go through these nonprofits to be distributed. And then the 7 billion is with this is kind of like its other bucket for justice communities. And there's 2 areas where the greenhouse gas reduction fund will go. It's direct investment in the projects, the low and zero emission projects themselves. And then there's the indirect investments, which is just described that they go into these state and local green banks. And here's a little bit of a diagram to get a sense of how the money will flow. The 20 billion that's going to go towards nonprofit entities, some for low and zero emission projects. So this is some of this direct investment. And then this other bucket here where the 7 million is going to be another direct investment for projects. And I think there's still some confusion of where the money goes here. I believe it's just for distributing the funds. Like there's a lot of money set aside to distribute the funds. But if anyone has a little bit more clarity here, I would love to hear it.
Lady, do you know? Oh, I love that slide. Can we keep that? Oh, you don't know? Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Beth, do you know? No? This might be the TBD on our side at least. And because we're not really sure how higher ed would fit into it either, right?
Well, I think that they would fit into this low and zero emission projects. Like they would be applying for the money from the groups that get from the nonprofit groups that are going to be distributing the money. And I think there's a ton of money there. And I think that, like I said, there's not a ton of guidance yet, but I think that once that money goes out the door in February, like get your projects ready, start applying.
This, and can just stick with the slide just for a second, not for the green bank thing, but someone asked a question about how do funds flow? So like the idea that some funds are coming through agencies, for example. So like EPA will be given a larger budget to do certain things, and Department of Energy will be given a larger budget to do grant programs. Is there any kind of general rules of thumb of where most of the money flows through in the IRA, or is it just like each section has its own kind of channel of how it gets funded?
Unfortunately, it's like the legislative text defines who gets it. So in this case, it's all going to go through EPA. DOE is going to get a ton of it too. Yeah, that's not a very satisfying answer, I know.
No, that's right. Yeah.
And they each will have to provide their own guidance for how the money flows out. It's terrible. I mean, it's like navigating this in IIJA is a nightmare, and we're here to give you all the most amount of resources as possible for when they do start flowing.
Yeah. Hippolyte, any guidance you would have for the research you've done on the grant programs, specifically like the research grant programs? Is it mostly just through these different granting agencies, NSF, DOE, whatever? Or is there one agency that's really going to get a big bump up?
No, it seems that for the research funding, it's mostly through NOAA. And then for the environmental and climate justice block grants, it's through the EPA. Neighborhood access and equity is through Federal Highway Administration. So it's again what Tansy said, like every time for every section, they define who you have to go through and who will administer the funds.
Great. Well, we've got 3 more minutes. Maybe just, I would just say as I'll talk for a little bit, and if the panelists, if you can look over any of these Q&As that are in here that are specific. Like I know maybe there's a green hydrogen one, Hippolyte, that you might be able to speak to.
Yeah, sorry.
Just do some rapid fire ones real quick.
I clicked on the wrong button, but no, for I wanted to type an answer. Anyway, for that question on green hydrogen, it's actually emissions based. So the tax credit you get, so there's a cap on the amount of emissions associated with the production of the hydrogen, and the tax credit is higher if you produce hydrogen in a more clean or with less emissions. It's based on the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. And there's also kind of a consensus that if you do it through natural gas and carbon capture, you're most likely to claim the carbon oxide sequestration credit because you can't double up on the hydrogen and the carbon oxide sequestration. So most likely, yeah, it's going to be blue, whatever hydrogen. Color.
There's another one on sustainable aviation fuel. I thought that was an interesting one too. Do you know how that would work? The sustainable aviation fuel credit is directed, the question is from Mike, who is directed to receive that benefit? Is the carrier, is airlines or passengers, or could it lower the cost of higher ed to purchase sustainable aviation fuel? It's okay if we can't pull that one off.
I have that and take an answer. Yeah, or Tans, do you know?
I'm so not a aviation expert. I have text right now about what it looks like, and I will put this in the chat, but it's not as complicated as the legislative text. Just I'll put something in the chat.
Okay. What we can do, we know there's a few of these open ones that are really specific, and so we didn't want to dig into those directly, but we can take a look at these after the webinar's over and try to send that back out to people who are attending and hopefully get all your questions answered. So we are at time. I really, again, thank you to RMI, America's All In, MIT, and specifically Tansy, Ippoliti, Beth, and Steve to your participation. I think it's been really insightful. I would repeat what Ippoliti said before COP. We're going to have a kind of a white paper outlining in more detail some of these certain sections about the IRA and higher ed, doing that in partnership with the Aspen Institute. So look for that in the coming months. Really grateful for everyone who was able to join us today. We'll have this recording posted soon, and hope everyone takes care and champions this work. We champion this work in your communities to make change.